So, welcome everybody to the webinar, The EU's Response to the Refugee Situation in Afghanistan. It is with great joy that I open this panel. My name is Sergio Carrera. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS, in Brussels, and I will be chairing this panel. This webinar is co-organized between CEPS and the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute, the UI, in Florence. We are very happy to join cooperation and efforts with the colleagues at MPC. Big thanks to Andrew Guedes and Deisa Brumat for this cooperation. The event falls within the scope of the ASILE Horizon 2020 project that looks at the EU's role in implementing the Global Compact, the United Nations Global Compact on refugees. And this week, actually, we are closing the first training school with the students around the world who have shared their research and work in respect of refugee protection and also looking at the Global Compact. Now, today's event really aims at examining the main policy responses of the European Union to the challenges that are being experienced by so many people, refugees and people looking for international protection from Afghanistan, and really take the time to interrogate what's the EU's role, or what the EU could be, what role could the EU take. We've seen the statement issued by member states' ministries of interior, which have paid particular emphasis to securitizing the conversation and relabeling Afghan nationals as illegal migrants when in fact they are looking for protection, international protection. We also have the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum with a number of initiatives and proposals. And CEPS has just published a new European Parliament study analyzing each of those proposals. And we would like to take those initiatives and put them in light of the Global Compact on Refugee commitments. The UNHCR starts with protection, with international protection as the point of departure, and really puts international refugee law and human rights instruments at the very core of the legitimation of policy responses in this area. Now we have a wonderful panel today. I'm very excited because we are bringing together a group of very high-level and long-standing policymakers, experts and colleagues and friends from EU institutions and agencies, international organizations and NGOs that I will introduce in a minute, to have a dialogue and a conversation with a group of students, acting as discussants, students who have participated in the ASILE training school, so as really to have this public policy conversation between different representatives. Now, rules of procedure, I'm the chair, so I'm bringing the rules to the forefront. We have 1 hour and 30 minutes to enjoy. We have a panel. Each of the speakers have been given 8 minutes. So I would kindly remind all of you to keep this time so as to allow a proper and quality conversation. And then we will move to the discussants. In terms of Q&A, for those who are watching us in YouTube, most welcome, warm welcome. You can put your questions in the Q&A, actually comments in this option in YouTube. You may need to register and have your own account. Hopefully you can do that without difficulty. We will be selecting those questions and bringing them back to the panel. Now, time is always, we're always lagging behind a little bit. So I will move immediately to introduce the panel, starting with Juan Fernando López Aguilar, member of the European Parliament, chair of the LIBE committee, the committee responsible for this and many other exciting and very complicated policy areas in the EU. We are delighted to have Juan with us and start the panel. Juan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation, and I'll try to make it short, summarized version. Certainly, the Afghan situation is a global breakthrough. It's a major issue, which is bound to make an impact in every area of EU policy and lawmaking, for that matter. In the first place, it seems to be an external dimension challenge of the European Union. And that's the analysis that you have heard of in the debates we've had so far, particularly with the High Rep Josep Borrell as head of European diplomacy and the External Action Service. It's been said time and again that this shows a major failure of analysis, intelligence, and policy making, because we have been lagging behind the United States. And so far, the United States made the unilateral decision of withdrawing. It was clear and announced that there would be a Taliban comeback to power sooner than later. It came sooner than expected, but it was certain that it was a high probability that it wouldn't happen. So it's a major challenge when it comes to building up the so-called autonomic strategic autonomy, the dimension of the European Union in the foreign policy making, and the capacity to build up intelligence, to have an analysis of its own from the European Union point of view as to the prognosis of an involvement of member states in the European Union, not only in the region, but in Afghanistan in particular. But then, of course, it also has an impact in the internal dimension, which is the one I am to refer, because it is obvious that the evacuation has been, at the outset, pretty chaotic, and then there has been some coordination. The Spanish contribution has been particularly praised because Spain set forth a so-called reception center in Torrejón, in which some thousands were brought from Afghanistan and are expected to be redistributed through some code of responsibility sharing with other member states. But having said this, the evacuation has not been sufficient, not enough, not by far. There has to be a step up, a major step up of this effort, common effort, coordinated by the External Action Services as to evacuate. But to evacuate, we need to put in place humanitarian corridors. And that is a mantra that you have heard time and again in the debates in the European Parliament. Linked to humanitarian corridors, the need for humanitarian visas, which has been a consistent call of the European Parliament, particularly mine. I have been an advocate, a champion of humanitarian visas. I actually set in motion as chair of the Libre Committee last mandate of the European Parliament, an initiative report to call for the Commission to take initiative, legislative initiative, as to putting in place a common European framework for humanitarian visas. Because yes, it is a fact that humanitarian visas are at the disposal of the member states individually, according to their national legislations, which is certainly the case of Spain, for instance. But it's not enough. It's not enough the provision of Article 25 of the European Visa Code, which is a regulation of which I was rapporteur. We need to step up the humanitarian visas regulation so that it can be enhanced, it can be multiplied in its impact, in its effect, as to bringing people from Afghanistan, particularly those most vulnerable. We're thinking all the time about women and children subject to the brutal discrimination against them, against women and children of the Taliban regime, but not only. Also, vulnerable people are those who have distinguished themselves for advocating for rights, activists, journalists, human rights activists in the country, or fleeing to Pakistan. So there is a need to bring the lessons also in this regard. And linked to humanitarian visas, of course, the need of a European resettlement framework. And then again, I have to remind that the Commission took initiative in 2016 with a new package to update the European Common Asylum System. One of its component elements, one of its files, is a resettlement regulation framework, regulation, which has been blocked by the Council. The European Parliament made its part of the job. We built up a majority support to support the European resettlement framework, but it was blocked by the Council. The first reading agreement of the European Parliament have been not endorsed by the COREPER, and the COREPER, which is the Council, has been unable so far to make up its mind. So humanitarian corridors, humanitarian visas, and resettlement framework are a sequence which is to be completed in order to fill with content the protection which is to be given to those who are to be evacuated. So my final point is that, again, time and again, you have heard in the debates in the European Parliament, just this week, because I just came from Strasbourg. I'm talking to you from the Canaries, but yesterday night I arrived from Strasbourg. And it's been said time and again that in order to protect those who are to be evacuated, the so-called temporary protection directive is to be finally activated. It's been 20 years in force, but absolutely overlooked, out of the picture, absolutely misused. So there is the need to grant some immediate protection status, temporary protection status of some kind to those who are to be evacuated and resettled once the European Union is actually matching its rhetoric with facts and with action, which is consistent with EU law in place. And the final point I would like to make is that, sure, you know that we are discussing, and there is a heavy involvement of the committee I chair in the discussion of the legislative procedure concerning the 5 files, which are the component elements of the so-called new Pact on Asylum and Migration, which is supposed to match also the philosophy and the approach of the Global Compact on Migration and Asylum adopted by the United Nations Assembly in Marrakesh and Geneva. So there is a discussion, there is an ongoing discussion. But believe me if I tell you that there is a clear majority in the European Parliament to come with clear definitions which are consistent with EU values, for one thing, but there is also real solidarity in the making. Binding solidarity, obligatory solidarity, which is not to be superseded by a twofold branch of choices, some solidarity for those who are the coalition of the willing, and for the rest, simple returns, simple returns. And that is why we finally have also rejected very strongly, the conclusions of the latest Council of Justice and Home Affairs ministers, August the 31st, because they are unacceptable. Yes, you said it, Sergio. They are leaning on security, obsessed with the alleged massive influx of Afghans which are to come and prevented from coming. So there is an emphasis of securitizing the external borders of the European Union and preventing those in need, those asylum seekers, potential asylum seekers, and those refugees, and those people fleeing from the tyranny of the Taliban to make it to Europe. So the main recommendation of that conclusion is to keep them in the countries of transit, keep them aside of defense the external borders of the European Union. That is a totally unacceptable approach. We need to match the humanitarian lessons of the European Union involvement in the Afghan situation, in the Afghan crisis, not only as to the external dimension, building up a true European foreign policy coordinated truly by the external service and by the high rep, not only putting some added value to the individual actions of the member states, but also as to the internal dimension, making sure that humanitarian protection is actually effective to those who are deserving the protection of the European Union and its member states, provided that they have shown commitment to the values of the European Union, and for the European Union for which the European Union should stand for, with the risk of their life, personal integrity. And that risk must be taken seriously when you talk about the Taliban regime, which is going to last for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan, for this very clear and passionate introduction to our conversation and your call and your highlighting the work of the European Parliament that for so many years has been calling for humanitarian corridors, humanitarian visas, and now they're still pending indeed resettlements, EU resettlement framework. And you bring the ball, back to member states, governments, and the council in respect of the lack of progress in this respect. And I also found very interesting your call for immediate protection, group recognition, the possibility really to offer immediate protection status to everybody in needs. It's very important, and your call for equal solidarity as well. So thank you so much. Now, the next speaker is Johannes Luckner. He is Deputy Director of DG Home of the European Commission. Johannes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And in the interest of timekeeping, I would be grateful if after 6 minutes you could give me a little signal so I know where I am. I've been asked to relate the situation in Afghanistan and our response on the one hand to the pact and on the other hand to the global compact on refugees. Now, as you know, in September, we are celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the pact. And as you also know, and as Mr. Lopez Aguilar has already hinted at, progress has been made, but it is slow. And I think the events in Afghanistan and our reaction to the events in Afghanistan show that it is more urgent than ever to make progress on the pact. Now, the EU has also supported the development of the Global Compact on refugees, advocating inclusive and comprehensive responses to refugee crisis, which is also what the pact is doing, but for the moment we don't have this framework. And the Global Compact is basically based on the same values of shared responsibility and solidarity in order to change the way that we respond to refugee situations, assisting both refugees and the communities that host them. The EU is currently chair of the core group of the solution strategy for Afghan refugees and its support platform, which was launched in 2019 at the Global Refugee Forum. And therefore, we continue to play a leading role in supporting Afghan refugees in the region. However, now the situation, of course, has changed and become even more serious. And therefore, a few words on what we're doing. Now, you have both already made reference to the extraordinary meeting of Interior Ministers that took place on the 31st of August. I must say that in these first days and moments, it is true that the focus has been on evacuation, the focus has been on security. However, at the same time, and maybe less visible, there was a clear decision that we're not going to turn our back on the people who remain in Afghanistan. And I think when we talk about refugees, we need to first talk about the origin of them being refugees, which in many cases goes beyond those who are clearly attacked for political reasons. Therefore, the European Union has, and by that I mean Commission and Member States, has almost quadrupled the humanitarian aid for Afghanistan for 2021, with a pledge of approximately 670 million euros. We will also, based, I think, on the experiences we've had over the last decade, focus heavily on the provision of health and education services with women and girls as priority beneficiaries, but to make sure that this very, very basic socioeconomic fabric holds together. Now, on the issue of providing protection, I would like to recall that it is our moral responsibility to offer durable solutions, to offer legal, safe, and well-organized pathways, and to do so with a strong gender dimension for Afghan nationals who have been forced to flee from the Taliban to neighboring countries. And we cannot abandon, and we must, of course, prioritize in the first place journalists, NGO staff, human rights defenders, human rights advocates who have fought for this agenda, judges also over the last couple of years. Now, As you have already said, humanitarian legal pathways have come to the center of attention in the context of the situation in Afghanistan. The new pact would give us good tools to respond to this situation. The recommendation that was part of the pact on legal pathways to protection in the EU calls for protection to be given to those in need, and resettlement, of course, is a tried and tested tool to provide that protection to vulnerable refugees. We want to, however, in the context of the pact, also promote other legal pathways to protection, notably complementary pathways that are linked to education for work, for instance, to family reunification, and therefore humanitarian pathways are an integral part of the new pact. Now, in terms of action, you are probably aware that the European Union is preparing the next resettlement program for 2022. Clearly, the resettlement of Afghan nationals should be a priority in this context. And this is why we are now organizing an additional resettlement forum to discuss the exact needs. I say additional because we just had one before the summer in July, where the United States, Canada, and the UK as leading countries in resettlement were, of course, also present, and we have reached out to them. Now, my speaking points are in many aspects very similar to what Mr. Lopez Aguilar just said, because I want to emphasize that it is indeed very important to conclude the negotiations on the proposal for the resettlement framework regulation. What I can tell you is that also informally, just this morning, we are looking at all possible avenues in preparing the resettlement forum, and that includes humanitarian admission, in order to help people as quickly as possible. As you know, resettlement takes some time, and it is based on the notion that people need to come from third countries, not directly from Afghanistan. So we are also looking into all these technical and legal questions to make sure we can be as fast as possible. But in the end, of course, we do depend on member states. Now, to conclude, for the moment, we have reports that most of the migration and displacement movements have been reported to be within Afghanistan, and we do not have perfect intelligence at this stage in how far that is due to closed borders or in how far that is due to a willingness of people to try and stay in Afghanistan. I think historic comparisons can only go so far, and I see many differences in this situation from the one we have faced in 2015, and therefore I don't find it particularly helpful to draw a parallel here, because both the European Union and the world have moved on. What I would like to do in conclusion is to assure you that the situation of Afghan nationals, in particular those at high risk right now, is and will continue to be a priority for EU action in Afghanistan. We will work closely with our partners, with international organizations, but also with neighboring countries in the Afghan neighborhood and the countries in our own neighborhood to look at all facets of this crisis. As you will have seen, the High Representative has already called for a regional platform where such discussions with neighboring countries could take place. And last but not least, of course, President von der Leyen personally in the State of the Union speech has made it clear that she wants to see a package for Afghanistan. She's also made clear that the pact on migration and asylum gives us everything we need to manage these different types of situations we face, be they regular flows, be they the situation now emerging in Afghanistan, but also the unfortunate events that we have seen, for instance, at the Belarus-Lithuanian border over the summer. So I think all the elements are there, and the realities, unfortunately, are there to give us very strong arguments that it is high time to agree on the pact and agree on a true European migration management policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Johannes. Very interesting to see this alignment, how important it is, this alignment between the European Commission and the European Parliament when responding to Ministries of Interior narrow focus and approach. And thank you also for highlighting the need not to draw false parallels, and mentioning that we've moved on. And the fact that at present, the majority of people are in fact IDPs, internally displaced in the country, or they are in the neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iraq. This also reflects the reality that, as in previous situations, that many of those Afghan nationals will not reach the European Union. And last, I hope we will come back to that later, about the first access, spontaneous arrivals, and how to ensure that member states still keep up to their legal obligations to offer dignity and protection to people who may not go through legal complementary pathways, but who may actually just arrive irregularly because of the lack of those legal possibilities to make it. So thank you so much. Next is Madeleine Garlick. We are so happy to have Madeleine with us. She's also indeed an expert in questions of EU asylum policy and law, and she's chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice section in the Division of International Protection and UNHCR. UNHCR is actually a partner of the Horizon 2020 project, and we are very happy to have you and hear your views on these matters, Madeleine.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for that introduction. And really, I can only underline UNHCR's pleasure to be working closely with those involved in the Horizon 2020 consortium, with its focus in particular on examining the implications of the Global Compact on Refugees to the EU, as well as the role that the EU can play in its implementation, noting the EU treaty obligations to ensure that the common policy on asylum needs to be in line with the 1951 Refugee Convention and other international treaties. It's a very timely discussion that you have arranged today, because I think really a key question for everybody working on international refugee protection right now is what we can and should do more effectively to address the challenges linked to displacement within and from Afghanistan. And in that connection, a central question for both UNHCR and many states is indeed, what is going to be then the relevance and the role of the Global Compact on Refugees? I think we can fairly say that really this is a seminal test for that instrument, and whether it can indeed support and ensure more effective and predictable responses to large-scale arrivals and provide a basis for more equitable and effective responsibility sharing. I'd like now in my short presentation to summarize some of UNHCR's key messages and calls to the EU, and look at the question of whether and how indeed the pact can provide a basis for an effective and principled response to some of the challenges linked to Afghanistan in line with international and European standards. So to summarize, perhaps 4 key calls that UNHCR has made in this connection. We've called upon the EU and its member states to support the response to the situation in Afghanistan, including the very significant levels of internal displacement and the humanitarian needs that have been associated with that. In that connection, we really welcome the support that the EU and member states have provided so far, to which Johannes has referred, being mindful that this is going to need to be supplemented by further engagement over the months to come. We've also, in that connection, also underlined the importance of supporting the host countries in the region, notably Pakistan and Iran, which have, of course, hosted large-scale Afghan refugee populations for decades now, notwithstanding the fact they are not parties to the Refugee Convention, and clearly under strain in many respects, and likely to continue to face challenges continuing to host refugees as numbers continue to grow. We've also underlined the importance of maintaining access to territory and asylum in Europe for Afghans, noting in that connection that expressions of solidarity abroad can't be to the detriment of effective and sustainable direct access to asylum in Europe. and honouring of the obligations of European countries where refugee protection responsibilities and obligations are engaged. We have also called on the EU and its member states to seek to enhance resettlement and complementary pathways for Afghans, underlining the additional commitments that are needed should be over and above the minimum of the 30,000 resettlement places for 2022 that the Commission has called upon EU member states to pledge by September of this year. In that connection, we've emphasised that safe pathways, including resettlement, should complement and not be a substitute for the direct access to protection for persons who apply for asylum, and that these can play an invaluable role in providing safe and legal alternatives that may obviate the need for people to undertake dangerous and irregular journeys. We've also encouraged states to apply more flexible and expedited processing for family reunification applications of Afghans, and to try and expand other legal pathways such as humanitarian admissions and visas. And in that respect, we strongly support the calls that Juan Fernando has made in that regard, where the EU has done a great deal of important work that could provide a basis for steps forward and life-saving interventions in this regard. We also welcome the organisation by the Commission of the additional resettlement forum that Johannes has mentioned, and we see that as a key opportunity for the EU to step up and to show solidarity with countries in the region and with the Afghan people who are in need of protection as well. We also, fourthly, want to welcome the decisions that have been made by a number of EU member states to suspend forced returns of rejected asylum seekers to Afghanistan. On the 16th of August, UNHCR issued a non-return advisory in this regard, highlighting what we saw as potential immediate risks of refoulement if forced returns were to continue. We're working at present on revising our eligibility guidance with its detailed assessment of country conditions that will pronounce in more detail on potential protection needs, which we hope will provide an important resource and guidance for states which will be determining asylum claims from Afghans in the months to come. So against this background, we note that the Pact does present an opportunity to address some of these challenges and to strengthen Europe's management of arrivals in a more effective way. We have made our position clear on the Pact in the past. We think that it's crucial that the validity of asylum requests need to be effectively assessed upon arrival in a given country through fair and efficient procedures. This means that effective and real protection needs to be given to those who need it, and those who do not need it should be addressed through prompt, safe and dignified return arrangements in accordance with due process in international law. The Pact provides a basis for these enhancements and improvements to some of the challenges that we see in the implementation of EU law, and we really hope that it's going to provide, that the Afghan crisis will provide an effective impetus to help discussions to advance in this regard. We also want to recall, however, at the same time, that there can't be piecemeal implementation of the Pact. And it's important to retain the comprehensive approach that's inherent in the Pact, which reflects GCR's holistic approach as well, and not merely focus on external dimensions, and notably not merely on seeking to prevent arrivals or so-called illegal onward movement. We also want to emphasize that it's going to be important over the months and weeks to come to seek to avoid a number of dangers that we see could arise in light of some of the political discourse and rhetoric that we see. We need to ensure that we are going to safeguard against unreasonable and unworkable barriers to access to territory, illegal pushbacks, which could prevent people who are in need of protection from accessing their rights and safe territory and opportunities to have their claim examined in Europe. We see risks that people on the move can be instrumentalized for political purposes in ways that can be problematic, not only for the states concerned, but for the international protection system as a whole, not to mention the individuals who could be directly involved in that. We also see real risks of externalization of international protection obligations, which is not consistent with the letter or the spirit of EU law. And we also see real dangers in an erosion of a commitment to predictable intra-EU solidarity, which is more needed at this time than any other. So in sum, I think what we really see is that the EU has the tools, the instruments, the institutions, and the potential really to be able to rise to the challenge posed by Afghan displacement. The question is going to be whether or not we can ensure that the political will and the cooperative, holistic, long-term approach that's going to be needed to ensure that this can be put into practice can be found. UNHCR certainly is ready to support the EU and its member states in working towards that goal. And we really want to underline in that connection that we count on the EU as a crucial global actor with regard to refugee protection in a region of asylum, which has a strong legal order and a tradition of asylum, which really enshrines human rights and international solidarity as its founding values. Happy to take questions, and thanks once again for inviting us today.
Thank you, Madeleine, for your excellent presentation and for reminding us about this principle of additionality. You know, see solidarity abroad hand-to-hand with first and dignified access to asylum in Europe, and for bringing us back to the spirit that was also so much mentioned, the ALMA by President von der Leyen's State of the Union speech of the European integration and European Union. And also your also advice for us to critically look at narratives that dehumanize the debates of those arriving irregularly at EU's external borders. So thank you so much. Now, next is Cecilia Andersen, head of unit at Danish Refugee Council, DRC. The DRC is also a partner of the ASILE-project, and Cecilia is also a very active colleague in the project, and we are very grateful to have DRC partnering up in the network. Cecilia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sergio, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the participants of this first training school within the ASILE framework. I hope you've had a wonderful time. Yes, DRC is a very happy member of the ASILE-project, and thank you for inviting us to join today. So I think after the last few weeks, the seriousness of the situation in Afghanistan and the following displacement situation is clear to everyone. And I think what is key for DRC is that it is addressed first and foremost as a protection crisis, and that all focus is directed towards ensuring safety and protection for people affected. It has already been mentioned a few times, so I will refrain from doing so, but it's important to remember that the vast majority of displaced Afghans will continue to be internally displaced and hosted in neighboring countries. And that is also why we are concerned by the preoccupation of some EU leaders, not all, with preventing people from reaching safety in Europe, rather than focusing on what Europe can do to protect the people of Afghanistan and to support countries in the region. And we think that what has already been mentioned, that the outcome of the recent extraordinary Home Affairs Council underline this point. But for this short intervention, I'll try to focus on three main areas of concern related to the EU response to the challenges of people who are seeking international protection because of the situation in Afghanistan. And the first is around access to territory and safety. Secondly, around access to fair asylum procedures. And then finally, if time allows me, on international solidarity and responsibility sharing, linking up with the Global Compact for refugees. So ensuring access to territory for people seeking protection now is key. With the evolving situation in Afghanistan, the international community, including the EU, has an important role to play in ensuring that neighboring countries keep borders open and allow refugees and asylum seekers from Afghanistan to enter and seek protection. Right now, we see that requirements to enter neighboring countries, such as visa and other documentation, remain restricted, and that many fear the journey simply getting from parts of the country to the borders due to checkpoints. So countries across the regions are increasingly bolstering borders in order to stem the movement of Afghans to and through their borders. We've seen Iran deploying military forces at the borders to Afghanistan, and Turkey has further bolstered its southern border to Iran. And we've seen the messaging from the EU Commission on the priority on climbing down on smugglers in the neighboring countries to avoid Afghan refugees moving through irregular means, and this has an impact on that. So in line with the approach outlined in the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, border management and actions to counter human smuggling are prioritized in the envisaged support to neighboring countries and along transit routes. The role of actors facilitating irregular journeys must, however, be seen in conjunction with the, for now, absence of sufficient safe and regular pathways and restrictive measures to block and prevent departures. So the policies, at the EU's own borders in countries such as Greece and Croatia, refugees and migrants trying to enter continue to be pushed back. This is not something new, but it's something that continues to happen and will affect those people fleeing from, the Afghan situation as well. It's crucial that routes remain open for people who are seeking safety and that they are not pushed back. We think that the practice of pushbacks and collective expulsion at European borders must be investigated, must be sanctioned, and it must be stopped. For DRC's own office, we've seen in the weeks between 16 and 29 August, they've documented about 60 illegal pushbacks allegedly perpetrated by the Croatian police against Afghan families in Bosnia who were attempting to reach the EU. The EU Pact on Migration and Asylum is an opportunity to address this lack of accountability and impunity for serious and degrading rights violation at the borders. They could do so by introducing measures to ensure full accountability for the pushback and other illegal practices at borders. And of course, independent border monitoring is an important step in that direction. Beyond its own borders, the EU must ensure that the protection and safety of refugees are at the core of policies addressing human smuggling, and that the evidence of the unintended harmful protection implication of anti-smuggling measures are adequately considered in policy responses in the region. So on my second point, access to asylum, what is key is that those who seek international protection are swiftly giving access to fair asylum procedures. We expect that the number of spontaneous arrivals to the EU are not likely to become unmanageable, especially if EU do prepare. And there's been ongoing debates in the European Parliament on the application of temporary protection directive. And we think it's a step in that direction. While DRC does not find that now is the appropriate time for that, given the low numbers of arrivals, for those that arrive spontaneously, the debate on which protection tools should be applied rather than how borders should be secured is very much welcomed. It's also important to mention that the current practice in certain countries on deeming asylum applications inadmissible due to safe third country assessments should be approached with great cautions in this situation as well. With the new Greek legislation specifically referring to Afghans, among a few other nationalities, it's obvious that this will have consequences for the EU's overall responsibilities for Afghans seeking protection. And in this respect, DRC is very concerned to see that these assessments and rejections to safe third countries is codified as obligatory in some situations in the revised regulations of the EU Pact, while also attempting to limit the requirements for what actually constitutes a safe third country. So when discussing asylum procedures in Europe in relation to Afghans at present, we want to mention two groups based on what we see in the DRC offices around Europe. And one is that people who have already had their asylum application processed and rejected, but are staying in a limbo situation with very few rights in Europe, not able to return because of the current situation. Many of those will now qualify for refugee status and should have their cases reopened immediately by the immigration services or authorities, appropriate authorities in different countries. Some have already done so. And apart from conflicts with Taliban, we know that special attention will have to be made on the situation of women as a particular social group, as well as imputed political opinion for people who've been staying in Western countries for a long time. Secondly, and what has already been debated, the group of evacuees must without delay receive a sustainable legal status, and they will need swift access to society, including labor markets, as well as family unification. And we will also assume that many of those will qualify for refugee status and should therefore not be granted fewer rights. So Sergio has been so kind to inform me that my time is up, and luckily many others has mentioned the responsibility sharing element, which is of course a very important one. And I will then just say that I very much agree to that element on safe pathways, resettlement challenges, etc. So thanks. Sorry for taking a bit more time than I think I was allocated, Sergio.
No, thank you, Cecilia, for keeping up the time actually, and we shall come back to that question, I am sure, later. Before we continue, just to remind everybody that we are actually compiling your questions in the YouTube chat. So do feed in the chat, express views and questions that you have for any of our panelists while the conversation is ongoing. And thank you, Cecilia, for all your points and for highlighting how important it is the role of NGOs in monitoring what happens or what should not happen actually at EU external borders. And you mentioned the pushbacks. This leads me to the next and last speaker of the panel, Tamas Molnar, a Program Officer, Legal Research and Data Unit at the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, which has published excellent reports and research, such as the latest one, on fundamental rights issues at EU land external borders. Tamas, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chair, dear Sergio, for giving me the floor. First off, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very topical and insightful panel. If you don't mind, I have prepared a couple of slides, really a couple, so I would like to share it with the audience, just to accompany what I'm gonna say. My question is, can you see it now? Okay, so I've been asked by the organizers to talk a bit about FRA's research on borders and migrants, asylum seekers and refugees. So my intervention might be a bit different from the ones you have heard so far. I would like to give a tour d'horizon of the guidance and written advice FRA has prepared on that matter, which also applies in the context of Afghani refugees, or just generally speaking to the situation in Afghanistan, it's all of its repercussions. Just to start with, I would like to highlight three aspects from a fundamental rights perspective, which are of relevance when assessing what to do and what not to do. First off, we have already Afghan nationals on the territory of EU member states, those in limbo situation or rejected asylum seekers. It is important to hold the removals from EU member states, the Afghani people, to avoid the risk of refoulement, which is now quite heightened back in the country. Just to give you an example, in August, the European Court of Human Rights granted an interim measure under Rule 39 of the Rules of the Court to an applicant from Afghanistan who was supposed to be removed from Austria. And this interim measure ordered Austria not to proceed with the removal, which sends out a clear signal concerning the seriousness of risk of ill treatment in the country. Then the second scenario or aspect occurs at the external borders. It's key to respect the prohibition of refoulement and collective expulsion of protection seekers at the EU external borders as well, especially now for those who are coming from Afghanistan or from the region. And let's say a right compliant border control includes a lot of issues such as access to territory, access to asylum procedures, access to remedies, and you name it. And given the heightened risk of rights violations at the borders, it is also important to provide for an effective mechanism to monitor of the law enforcement activities in those areas, and to go the full circle to make sure that investigations follow after allegations of rights violations. And the third aspect to mention is linked to legal pathways. Previous speakers have already mentioned the need to open legal channels, legal avenues for those in need of protection. And in addition to the considerations I just outlined and the others also said, it's important to explore and activate also legal pathways. It's not an either or, but it's in addition to all the actions that must be taken in the context. Here, I just would like to recall a paper that the Fundamental Rights Agency published some years ago as a result of a research, which is on exploring legal entry channels into the EU, offering a toolbox of the possible measures. And these have already been mentioned. So here I subscribe to the previous speakers on that point. And we also, the agency listed resettlement, humanitarian admission, then issuing visas on humanitarian grounds, temporary protection, as well as medical evacuation. So now moving on, this just an outline of let's say the complexity and the diversity of the matters. FRA has been given guidance and advice on fundamental rights challenges and issues linked to migration and asylum. So I will not dwell upon this given the lack of time. This slideshow can be shared, so you will be able to look at it more thoroughly after that. Here, just to recall a couple of recent FRA research outputs relating to the borders and the rights of the people on the move. And why to recall these? Since these condense sometimes highly complex EU and international legal standards in a simple, straightforward, easy to understand manner. So we just produce guidance and not creating new norms. You're not advocating for new rules, but try to present what is out there. Is that there is a lot of law out there, both at the EU and international law level. To start with, last March with the Council of Europe, FRA published a restatement of EU and Council of Europe law on fundamental rights of refugees, asylum applicants, and migrants at European borders. This is a keystone, let's say, practical guidance, we believe, in understanding and just refreshing of the standards applicable when people in need of protection, but also just migrants as such, arrive at EU borders. And to operationalize that, we also published a practical guidance for border guards, specifically for border guards or border controls and fundamental rights at external land borders, which is like a set of do's and don'ts, 10 do's and don'ts for border guards. Another issue which is important after the arrival at the borders, how to provide reception to those people, and initial reception facilities, external borders, might trigger quite key and crucial fundamental rights challenges. So we also produced guidance on how to make it right when it comes to their reception at the borders. Then most recently, another exercise with the Council of Europe led to the restatement of the law, again, EU and Council of Europe law, of European standards on legal remedies, complaint mechanisms, and effective investigations at the borders, which is, again, quite key in the context of the Afghan situation. If people from Afghanistan come and present themselves alongside EU borders, be it sea or land or even air borders. We have also a handbook on European law relating to asylum, migration, and borders, which is like a big, comprehensive, practice-oriented handbook stating all the EU and Council of Europe legal standards, which can be helpful for practitioners, for all who wants to make sure that their action is fully right compliant. And FRA also produces regular overviews of migration-related fundamental rights concerns. The next one will be out in 1 week time. And in those quarterly bulletins, we call them, we also cover member state practices regarding returns to Afghanistan. So it's a good source to keep up with the latest developments, what member states do in this regard. So I would leave it here. Just to recall that there are a lot of standards, EU and international law standards out there. They just must be applied correctly, and FRA stands ready and gives the support to help authorities, EU institutions, agencies, and all stakeholders to get it right. Thanks for your kind attention. I'm at your disposal, of course, for questions.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that's me, right, with the clock. The only difference is that I have no hair. So thank you so much for keeping it on time. We are gathering actually very interesting questions before continuing with the conversation. For example, for Juan Fernando, we have Marie Walter asking about what is, you mentioned the Temporary Protection Directive, Juan Fernando, but also you are responsible for the crisis proposal as well, as you mentioned. And there you have an immediate protection also component. Where are we? Marie asks, how advanced are we in these negotiations? And also perhaps for you, Juan, Gustavo Alvarez asks about how do you see the role of peer review by national parliaments? National parliaments that also played a key role in the Lisbon Treaty. Can democratic accountability at national level also steer these political commitments in the global compacts, in your view?
Thank you for the questions. I'll try to make them short. First, a major concern of the European Parliament, actually a priority when it comes to lawmaking of this new migration and asylum pact, is to state clearly that it won't be a pact until the Parliament makes it its own, because it is of the essence that the member states finally understand that after the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, nothing less than 11 years ago, they have been enforced. 11 years they have been enforced now. They no longer are the masters, the exclusive masters of migration policy making, migration lawmaking, or asylum policy making and asylum lawmaking. It is the European Parliament, an essential component. And we want that this legislation, consisting of nothing less than 5 acts, 5 legislative acts, all of them regulations, are consistent with each other. So definitions have to be clear. Definitions have to be consistent. And we find that in these different pieces of legislations, there are different legal concepts: crisis, massive influx, force majeure, rendering non-functional the common European asylum system. All of them have to be linked together, and they gotta make sense. We want to do away with the force majeure, which is an elaboration of the case law of the European Court of Justice, and go direct to a crisis, to a situation of crisis, which describes clearly, with no discretion or arbitrariness, nor by the Commission, nor by the member states, as to this concept of massive influx, which is not to be handled according to the usual standards of the asylum migration procedures, or the RAM, which is the regulation on asylum and migration management, or the asylum procedures, which is also to be a regulation. Having said this, we find that the concept of immediate protection, which is set forth in the crisis regulation, is to supersede the as to now non-functional, as to now overlooked, as to now actually never used Temporary Protection Directive, which has been enforced 20 years now. Why it has not been used? The member states keep arguing that for the Temporary Protection Directive to be activated, it takes that already there is an overwhelming massive influx of asylum seekers or people asking for humanitarian protection according to the Geneva Statute and its developments in the national legislations, and they have to be already in place for them to be granted temporary protection. And it is not the case, which is contradictory with the views that you have seen in the conclusions of the Council of Ministers and Interior, because they argue that we have to prevent that massive influx from ever happening. We have to keep them off the European Union in the first place, which is not only a contradiction in its terms, but it also somehow reveals which is the state of mind of the governments when it comes to this point. On the contrary, in my view, in the parliament, there is an increasing majority with the so-called Afghan state of mind, which could bring impetus to a new activation of all the tools at disposal in order to protect people, particularly those vulnerable. women is the ultimate example, but not the only one. Those fleeing and making it to Europe, they do have to resort to some prima facie protection, insofar as they have been activists or advocates for the EU values and human rights, and they have exposed themselves to that serious risks of being not only harassed or tortured, but also eliminated by the Taliban. So
what about national parliaments, Juan Fernando? What about the role of national parliaments?
Yeah, and the second point, the national parliaments, we have, from the Libe Committee, we have done our best to gather national parliaments with the European Parliament according to the articles which relate to the so-called interinstitutional parliamentary conferences, interparliamentary conferences on the area of liberty, justice, and security. But in the national parliaments, there is a wide variety of arithmetics and political situations. There are national parliaments which live progressive to these issues, and there are national parliaments which are obsessed with endorsing the anti-migration attitudes and negative outlook, which is being endorsed by their governments. So national parliaments, it's a matter also of national politics. We do care in the European Parliament that at least when we get together, we all talk European. It is not that there is a situation in which the members of the European Parliament are talking European and the members of the national parliament are only talking national. But yes, I guess national parliament should also exert control on the national government, particularly of those who have been most relevant as to the missions in Afghanistan, and ask for accountability when they have not kept up their standard, their stature in the evacuation process. And that is a fact. I don't want to play the game of naming and shaming, which is so often the case in the European Parliament. But I think it's no mystery that some member states have behaved properly when evacuating their relevant cooperators in Afghanistan and bringing them to the safe place, which is the European Union, and some member states have not. Some member states have simply left them behind, and some member states are not willing to actually match their acts with their rhetoric or with their speech, on the grounds that they fear that if they do so, that would again bring some sort of pull effect. So you have a variety of situations. Some member states have actually cooperated in solidarity when relocating those who have been evacuated, particularly from the center of Torrejón in Madrid. Some member states have behaved, but they don't say it on the grounds that they fear that if they say it, they will be criticized by the public opinion, they will be criticized by their national party, or they will be simply activating some sort of, unleashing some sort of pull effect. So you have a variety of situations. We need to come to a better state of mind in which we actually deliver, we speak about it, and we match the policy we are doing with EU values with the kind of explanation we provide before the European Parliament and to the public opinion. That is the summary I could share with you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. It's also, I know that you will need to leave us sooner, so at least you have this opportunity to exchange with some of the colleagues who are contributing with Q&A. But let's now move to our discussions, because we have three excellent researchers who are going to contribute as well to this panel. The first one is Eleonora Milazzo, a research associate at King's College London. The second one is Shadeen Al-Masri, PhD candidate at Danube University Remi in Austria, and then Valentina Marconi, University of Urbino Carlo in Italy. So let's start with Shadeen. Would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you for having me today. Firstly, it was a pleasure to watch everybody speak, and it was also really informative as much as it was interesting for me to listen to. I have a number of thoughts, I think, to share on what was said. And I think I want to put them along the lines of exceptionalization and categorization. And I have three general points along those lines. I hope I have time to go through all of them. So the first of these that I was thinking that was made by several panelists was on the who we're making out to be vulnerable in the crisis. And while that obviously has concerns with, making sure that the most vulnerable come out, especially along the lines of women, women being a vulnerable group, I do consider whether this is in line with the actual migration patterns coming out of Afghanistan or the asylum seeking patterns. The images that we saw, for example, of planes leaving Kabul, of deportation sites from Turkey, were also overwhelmingly men. So the question here, rather, I do not mean to say that there isn't an acute need for protection, obviously, for women in the crisis or in this context. It's more to consider whether or not this is in line with the actual agency of asylum seekers or the decisions that they would like to make in terms of exiting, and if this follows the patterns that they have undertaken in the past. Other concerns I have are a little more broad, and it speaks to the crisis-based response or the way we divide things along crises in general. And my first consideration here is on not necessarily being ad hoc, but in the sense that how when we respond to large crises, we do tend to respond to just that crisis. And that expansion of refugee admissions or protection program tend to happen not necessarily exclusively in lieu, but partially in lieu of other programs. And that this has a potential to obscure other individual claimants, for instance, but also other less represented crises. And I think we saw this particularly in 2015. I'm sorry to go back to historical example, perhaps that's historical, but we did see this, for example, in people going along, or in asylum seekers going along the Balkan route to reach their final destination, and certain nationalities being blocked because they weren't deemed to be as legitimate. So I do want to, I guess, proceed, or perhaps bring up this question of caution when we're speaking, or perhaps speaking about certain groups as being legitimate or not, because it does have implications to the way first people respond on the ground, and obviously how the media represents. If we're going to talk about women especially, I do remember seeing lots, and especially now with the climate that we're in, of men being ascribed with violence when they're pursuing or asylum seeking, along these routes. And when we're looking at the way aid distribution works as well, beyond admissions or asylum seeking in Europe, we know that, for example, if we're going to again go back to the past few years, the Venezuela crisis, I think, received something like 1/8 to 1/12 per capita funding as crises in South Sudan or Syria, or I want to say Myanmar as well. So I was just essentially here is more of a word of caution, whether or not these kind of the approaches that we take, if this is actually observing beyond the actual crisis, beyond that, the non-discrimination principles, to ensure that it's not just that we're expanding for a certain group, but to ensure that it's an equitable thing. I think that it needs to happen because it is a pressing issue. It's a large scale issue, a large scale movement, but to ensure that it happens equitably. The second risk, and this is something that I think is starting to unfold, the third risk starting to unfold, is that the shaping responses to an influx, around that influx, I think admissions based on where you're coming from sometimes can also open the door to rejections based on where you're coming from. And I think that's already enshrined somehow in the safe countries of origin list, but also in some of the logic that was coming forth with resistance from heads of state in Europe. And what's coming to mind right now is Austria, particularly on the way, not that this is a policy yet, but more of a statement, I suppose, at this point, on what was a justification to not take in more Afghans was hosting one of the largest Afghan communities in the world and the second largest in Europe. I think per capita or something. It's a very specific statistic, obviously. So if we're talking in terms of refugee crises, it shouldn't matter how many Afghans you already have. I think that's a given, right? It should be along the lines of the refugee intake or responsibility that you have. So essentially what I mean to highlight here isn't the question of whether or not it should be categorized along these lines, but more of the implications of that beyond that, and how that can be both an obscurity of other crises and also a way to skirt responsibilities to refugee intake. And I will leave my intervention there. Thank you.
Excellent points, Shadeen. Thank you so much for these words of caution. One of them actually corresponds with one of the questions by the participants, by George Spirou, on the question of discrimination on the basis of nationality and positive recognition rates, percentages that you mentioned. That is a very valid point. So thank you so much, Shadeen. Next is Eleonora.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for your very interesting and very valuable contributions. I have two brief questions. So the first one is going back to the issue of solidarity and responsibility sharing, and it is really about the prospects of EU solidarity when it comes to Afghan refugees and the states currently hosting them. So we have discussed this already. Some of you have mentioned this. There are many ways of acting in solidarity with them, but certainly resettlement should be part of the approach, a key part of the approach. At the same time, the response so far seems to be centered on intervening before Afghan refugees arrived at the EU external borders, de facto preempting or avoiding another so-called crisis, right? So, so clearly preempting reception crisis in the EU is not the same as addressing it and deploying as well instruments to solve it. So I guess my first question is, to what extent do you think that this is going to be a crisis solved or rather preempted through reliance on externalization and shifting of responsibility to third countries? And here I'm thinking also about the EU-Turkey relations on this matter. And then my second question is on the current situation of Afghan refugees passing through Kosovo as it unfolds. So we know that in August, Kosovo's government adopted a decision offering Afghan evacuees temporary protection, which of course is also different from refugee status, but still recognizes clearly defined rights, including freedom of movement. Of course, now the situation is unfolding, is unclear, but what we know at this point is that Afghan refugees in Kosovo or evacuees in Kosovo are not allowed to move freely. And so their freedom of movement is restricted. And there's little information as well about their living conditions at the moment. So I was wondering what your insights on this are, and also whether you think that this form of temporary solution is at danger somehow of becoming another reception crisis on its own somehow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonora. And last, we have Valentina.
Yeah, I'll be very short. Thank you so much for all your contributions. It was very interesting. And my point really is like, I partake the points of Shadeen and Eleonora. And for me, it's very important. I mean, this is, of course, a very serious situation, but also it's important to remember, I think that Afghan nationals have been fleeing Afghanistan for years, and that a lot of scholarship produced also in academia has shed light on how the security situation inside Afghanistan had been deteriorating in the last years. So despite that, deportation have continued, and right now people who have been deported to Afghanistan are in a very serious situation. So especially after, I think, the closure of the Balkan corridor, when thousands of people have been stranded along the Balkan route, I think a lot of Afghan nationals have been stuck along this route. And among them, there have been women traveling with kids alone, unaccompanied minors, a lot of them, and a lot of NGOs are doing a great work also in shedding light on the violence of this route. So really, I think, although of course the crisis, the moment of crisis calls for urgent solutions, I think it's very important that EU also plan for those who are already in their way to Europe and stuck somewhere along these irregular routes. And so my question really is, what can the EU do for these people? And also, a lot has been said about humanitarian corridors, and I was wondering, for example, if people who have international protection and are based in Europe will be able or facilitated to bring their families. So I know personally some people through my research that have families now in Afghanistan who don't feel safe and would like to help them come. So I was wondering if humanitarian corridors, of course, it's normal that the priority must go to people who are in direct danger, like maybe journalists, activists, but if also some kind of legal, family reunification kind of pathways is in process. And finally, I think another very important point is about deportation. Right now, I think deportation have been stopped, and I wanted to really ask, what's the debate inside EU institution about how to go about deportation? There is a deadline for them, to continue to be halted, and or not. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valentina. Family life and family reunification is so important because many of those people are given subsidiary protection status, which comes along with more restrictive possibilities to have their families to benefit and enjoy their families with them. Thank you so much. Now let's come back to the panel. Some of the questions raised by the discussants, and adding perhaps a couple of them from the participants who are watching us. Already, Eleonora mentioned to what extent relying on externalization or shifting responsibility to countries like Turkey or others, can this be really a solution? And this also corresponds with one of our participants, Fabrizio Parilli, who was also asking Johannes his views on the current relationship between Turkey and the EU in this respect when it comes to Afghan refugees, if Johannes could develop on this. And then there is the question, of course, on what about discriminatory treatment, and applying different recognition rates, remembering that the crisis proposal actually uses 75%. So people below 75, an average, EU average of positive recognition rate of 75% will be subject to accelerated border procedures under the pact. How do we deal with the discriminatory effects that applying such a figure would entail? But let's come back to the panel. Johannes, would you like to start? And that will be your closing words, by the way, for each of you. So take the chance also to have your final say. Please, very short each. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I will try to answer as best as I can to the questions raised. And let me maybe bring a perspective that, might not be very popular, but also one that you might not see every day. Interior ministers deal not only with refugees, they deal with terrorism, they deal with crime. So they do have a certain perspective. And I would not discard concerns about security. I'm an old humanitarian, and I see that every terrorist attack perpetrated in Europe by a migrant or somebody maybe with that status or an irregular, as you know, that happens from time to time, does a great deal of damage to what we're trying to achieve for refugees. Because in the public debate, then this all gets thrown in a basket. We have a very concrete situation now where I think interior ministers are absolutely right to take it seriously. We have Afghans being flown to the Western Balkans by third countries for a security screening. But what happens if they don't pass the security screen? Where do they go? They can't be returned to Afghanistan. They're not going to the country to which they wanted to go or intended to go. And there is, I think, a very legitimate concern that they might move to the European Union. And at the very least, of course, the European Union, the interior ministers should know who these people are. On the question of, as you call it, deportations, we call it returns. That's actually something I'm dealing with all the time. For the moment, that's stopped, and it was stopped by, I think, 3 countries came out and said publicly that they have stopped. 2 others wanted to continue. There are no returns to Afghanistan right now, and there have been no returns, I think, since June, July of this year. And the returns that took place were, I think, almost to 100% returns of convicted criminals. For the moment, I'm not aware of a return debate. The debate is the contrary. How can we help people who stay there, and how can we help those get out who need to get out because they have to fear for their life? On family reunification, what we have been trying to do in these evacuations actually is to get out families. And I just saw the images of our own local staff who came with their families and were evacuated with their families. Depending on your status, family reunification is one of the things that you really cannot change, that are guaranteed by law, again, depending on your status. But just to give you one figure, 40% of immigration into Europe is due to family reunification. And definitely, and you've seen that also in the pact, and it's also in the return procedures, it's a red thread running through that the family unity should be maintained to the extent possible as a matter of priority. The recognition rate, that's a very good question. To say that an Afghan in Europe over the last years has been equal before the law is difficult when you see the recognition statistics, because the divergence goes from 0 to 95%, and that's a bit too much to say that this is explained by specific circumstances. We are also working with the ASILE, with the asylum agency, to make sure that we get to a common approach to deal with asylum requests from Afghans, and that the divergence in approaches of member states in terms of screening of applications be minimized. On the externalization question, I know, of course, that some member states, well, at least one has made that official policy, others might have a tendency to. I think we have to be realistic. None of the neighboring countries of Afghanistan are very, very keen to take in a large number of Afghanis. Turkey is not very keen on that either. Formally, as far as I know, most of these, if not all of these, borders are closed. And large investments are being made to keep them closed. Now, our approach has been, after the initial reaction where we heard a lot that we need to now make sure that in neighboring countries everything is ready, our approach has been to say, wait a second, let's see first what we still can do in Afghanistan. Because much of the discussion always sort of pretends that people really want to leave. That's the only thing on their mind. And the reality is that 99.9% of people don't want to leave, and certainly not those who need protection. It's not that they want to leave, it's that they have to leave or die. So help those who want to stay is the first approach. Talk to the neighbors, but also support them, as we have supported Turkey in migration management. On the 2 questions of discrimination, there was one related to different crises, and it's true, one reacts to the crisis of the moment. We have, for instance, said for resettlement, we don't want to now not resettle Syrians because now we have Afghans. So our approach has been, we have pledges. We want to go beyond those because we now have an additional challenge with Afghans. On the question of discrimination of women, I think it's a very fair question, but what we observe in all, well, I think in almost all, maybe from Venezuela slightly different, but in almost all migration movements is that people send off young men, first and foremost. And then the rest is to follow. The reasoning is different. I mean, migration, you know, regular migration is a natural phenomenon. Irregular migration is a business, and it's a very dangerous business, and you take incredible risks. So I think that will be one of the motivations why men are being sent. Another one is, of course, the view of men and women. But I wouldn't say that because traditionally it's young men who come first, we should not now look and put a great emphasis on women, quite simply because in our view, the interpretation of the Sharia that the Taliban have is unacceptable, and those who suffer most from it are indeed women. So
we need to move on.
Yeah, that's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you for highlighting the need to differentiate asylum and security. You know how important it is to keep those differentiated, and the importance to keeping up with independence of asylum authorities as well. And you know, it is true that some ministries of interior, I believe at the moment still 6, keep on using non-evidence-based claims on security and secondary movements to still temporarily and illegally introduce border controls in Schengen. So we look forward to see what the Commission's next steps are in this respect. I know that Thomas will need to leave us as well. Thomas, will you have very shortly last words?
Yes, thanks, dear Sergio. Just let's say one sentence to conclude. The migration and asylum ramifications of the Afghan situation must be solved on the basis of the existing EU acquis on migration and asylum. So I just would like to highlight that this is happening now. The pact and the proposals under the pact are still the future. So it's important to underscore that member states have an existing set of EU legal standards, this asylum migration legislation, which contains robust safeguards and sufficient fundamental rights standards to do it right, to solve the situation and to deal with Afghanis either on the territories or coming from Afghanistan or in the region in a rights compliant manner. So again, my message is that the situation from the legal perspective is not that different from any other situation. And at the end of the day, we are not dealing with blocks. We are not dealing with faceless masses. We are dealing with individuals. And each state authority, member state authority, needs to carry out an individual assessment of every single person, no matter what their nationality, if they are Afghanis as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is also why it's so great that the Commission is making so much emphasis on ensuring independent monitoring mechanism of the EU external borders. Thank you, Thomas. Last words by Madeleine and Cecilia. Please keep it very short.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Perhaps I can just make 2 points, and let me really thank our discussants for their thought-provoking analysis. Firstly, on one of Shadin's points around the categories, I agree this is something about which we need to be extremely careful, because indeed the people who could be at risk in Afghanistan include many different groups. But for the purposes of those who may claim asylum in third countries, it's a question of really assessing what are the individual protection needs there. And indeed, women may be at particular risk, but there are also many others for reasons of their actual or imputed political opinion, their activities, perhaps even factional reasons in some case. So really, we have to be careful about any idea that there are some people who are who are vulnerable and in need of protection, and others who are not. In order to respect the criteria that EU law has established, it needs to be assessed on an individual basis. I think secondly, in that regard also, the reality is there are some people who are better placed to be able to leave their countries of origin. But it's not only those who might be in need of help, and that's where safe and legal pathways come in. If indeed there are people who remain within Afghanistan, or who remain in countries in the immediate region who are at risk there or can't find solutions, it's precisely those that mechanisms such as resettlement, such as humanitarian visas and others need to be ready to assist and protect. Second point on the notion of crisis, I think this is also something to really consider. The language of crisis in this context can be extremely unhelpful. It's scaremongering. It can create fear amongst publics and in ways that can erode commitment to responses that are in line with the EU's responsibility and human rights. And I think we really should question the idea, really, is displacement from Afghanistan the sort of crisis that the EU is unable to respond to. I think really the fact is rather on the contrary. The Common European Asylum System was designed precisely in order to enable EU states to respond more effectively to refugee movements. Back in the 1990s, the wars in the former Yugoslavia saw some 500,000 people displaced to Germany in 1 year. Vast numbers relative to what we see on the move today. And that was the time at which the EU decided we needed a legal framework, we needed institutions, we needed budgets to be able to handle this better. All these things are there now. It's a matter of ensuring that they can fulfill their roles and can do what the European Union has decided in its exercise of member states' sovereign authority that they want to have in place. So this is really, we all need to ensure that those tools can perform the role they're intended. And then perhaps just finally, the question of numbers. I think this is also an important one. Because even though indeed it's not appropriate for states to say, that they have existing large populations of refugees, so they shouldn't be expected to do more. But at the same time, the reality is we have enormous imbalances in the refugee populations worldwide. 85% of the world's refugees are in low or middle income countries, and some 2/3 in the least developed countries. Even within Europe, we have massive imbalances. We have some EU member states who are really doing an extraordinary job providing protection to people in line with EU norms, and others that are doing very little. So the question of how states can do more to ensure a more effective distribution of responsibility, and each state can step up in line with their obligations, and really in a way that can ensure that refugee protection needs are addressed in the interests of all states within the EU and beyond, is one really we need to grapple with. And the Afghan situation, I think, gives us an opportunity for Europe to respond in that more balanced and equitable way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madeleine. Cecilia, please brief.
Thank you. I will be very brief. I'd also thank you for so many good questions and comments that I very much support. I think it just one sort of general point came to mind, and then a short one afterward, if you would allow me, Sergio, is that I think in relation to this theme around challenges for people who are seeking protection, and not because if we talk about protection of people as such, then I very much agree that focus on people in Afghanistan should be the prime objective, obviously here. But for those who are seeking protection, I think the question that came up on what can EU do, and what for those who are already on their way or those who are stuck, and I think that the answer is very much comply with the existing rules. Do what they should within the law, as Thomas already said. I think that was great, and then look for a sustainable status. These are individuals, even people who have been evacuated, are not arriving in so large numbers that we don't have resources within the European countries to assess those on an individual basis. And then I just think that it's interesting to see how comparing the Global Compact for Refugees with the EU Pact relating to this area, because what I think that's sometimes lacking in the discussions is a policy coherence between the commitments you'll have with ministers in Geneva or in discussions on the Global Compact for Refugees with those that are going on in Brussels or with the interior ministers on the EU Pact. And I think it's so important that those objectives of the GCR sort of go together, and that you don't have just one strong focus on one of the four, but to keep them together, and efforts of easing pressure on host communities is so important, but it should never translate into a strategy of containment or prevention of movement. Then there were so many great comments on national-based approaches, on women in asylum procedures, but I think I'll have to refrain from answering them. But just if I were to end on a positive note, I really think that the resolution of the European Parliament adopted yesterday took a different approach than what we've seen from the Council, and in addressing the situation in Afghanistan as first and foremost a humanitarian crisis, a human rights crisis. And I think keeping that rather than viewing those who are fleeing as a security threat for Europe is so important. So thank you for great questions and comments that I'll be thinking about, I think, for the weekend to come.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. We need to put an end to this conversation, and it's been fascinating that one of the most consensual messages out of the different statements and inputs is that actually perhaps we should focus on complying with the existing rules, complying with the Common European Asylum System rules, with the current obligations that those ministries of interior actually do have as we speak, and that not all of them are actually fulfilling in practice. I need to close it here. Thank you so much. I need to give now the floor to Professor Andrew Guedes, the Director of the Migration Policy Center at the EY, who will be providing the closing remarks. Andrew.
Thanks, Sergio. Thanks to all the speakers. I think the closing remarks are addressed also to the participants in the ASILE training school. And I think the activities of the ASILE training school play a really important role in taking forward the debate we've been listening to this afternoon, because the training school's been about mutual learning. It's been a global event, researchers from all over the world having the opportunity to share their ideas and providing very important insights into the complexities of the issues we've just been discussing, looking at the normative questions associated with it, the political and institutional constraints that we can see across various levels, from the local to the international, and also the very important debates that occur across those levels, the points of consensus, and obviously crucially the points of dissensus and contention. And so I found it hugely informative to be able to listen into the work that's been done. There's some fantastic ideas that people have about ways forward, which I think we can share through the ASILE-project and other forums and engage with other researchers. I think one of the things that we want to do through the ASILE-project and this kind of event is initiate a conversation. The point of the training school is not just to meet and then leave, it's to meet new people, share ideas, and then find ways to take those ideas forward. Has published those ideas. Obviously, we're very happy to think about how we can support and facilitate that kind of activity, and of course, engage with people in positions of responsibility and try and think about ways that research and new ideas can be productive and valuable. So I think, I certainly don't want to take much time, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate in this kind of activity. And as I always say, these kind of events that we host here at the EUI, these conversations are ongoing. The event we've had today is hopefully the beginning of something, not an end. We want to stay in touch with the people who participate in our training school, the people who've joined us this afternoon via YouTube, of whom there are hundreds, and we're grateful for their input and their ideas. And obviously, we're really grateful to the speakers. These are incredibly difficult and complex issues, and we're very appreciative of the commitment and also the insight you provided to us this afternoon, which I think is really valuable for our participants. So we're very hopeful we'll be able to carry on this conversation with you and the wider community of people who engage with these issues, and look forward to doing so in the future. So, and finally, thanks to Sergio and his team at CEPS, who've done a fantastic job, along with colleagues here at EUI, particularly Lisa Brumat, in holding this all together. So thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world tuning in for our webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.